Hello, and you're very welcome to the week that really was with establishment stooge John McGurk and Fianna Fáil infiltrator Sarah Ryan, according to some of the comments we received on last week's show, which we'll come to in a second. Sarah, how are you?
Grant, how are you?
I am well, thank you. It's been a bit busy week, but before we get to the stuff we're going to talk about this week, I want to address some of the comments we received on last week's show because Sarah, some of the feedback now was fairly harsh. People felt like we had sort of turned tail and run away from them. There were a lot of people who took particular issue, I think, with some of our comments in relation to the events at Kildare Street, which are now 10 days ago, where I think we both took the view that, look, whatever your views are, you shouldn't be jostling politicians. But somebody said, do we read the comments? We do read the comments. And we did read people giving out about Sarah saying people should be water cannoned. And I did read the comments saying that the only reason people read Gript is for Ben Scallon and Fatima Gunny and Matt Tracy, and that, I should go away. We read all those comments. We take them on board. Sarah, I'll let you respond to them in a second, but I just wanted to say to people, look, we really appreciate that you listen to this show. We do take your comments on board. We understand, obviously, that passions are running high last week, and there's a big area of disagreement on these issues. But at the end of the day, if Sarah and I aren't giving you our honest opinions, folks, if we aren't telling you what we think, we're no use to you, because we'd just be telling you lies to keep you happy. And that's not what we're going to do. So when you get annoyed at what we say, we really appreciate it. We do read the comments, and we understand that your views are sincerely felt as ours are. And I think it's that's all we can say to you. We obviously, a lot of people did agree with us, but for those of you who didn't, we respect your right to disagree. But we're going to just hold our opinions and tell you what they are, because that's the honest thing to do. Sarah, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I mean, look, people are entitled to comment and disagree, fine. But it's important not to get mixed up between criticism of the behaviour and a criticism of the issue that the people were there protesting about. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'm just not never going to condone, and there was comments that said oh, there was nothing really happened or whatever. We're specifically talking about a video that showed a politician having a bottle thrown at his head and missing, going over his shoulder. I'm not going to condone that. That doesn't mean I disagree with any of the principles of what some of the people who were there think. There was so many different people, groups represented there. I couldn't possibly comment on all of them. But look, it is what it is. Emotions ran high, as you said, and people disagreed with us. That's fine. That's allowed. We're allowed to do that.
Yeah, and look,
allowed to have their opinion.
As bad as things got, at least Laurence Fox wasn't in the comments talking about you.
Come on, let's start with that, shall we? First of all, I follow Laurence Fox on Twitter, and I find him kind of interesting, and I think he's right about a huge amount of things that he says. Dan Wootton, I don't really like Dan Wootton personally, because I think, you and I have discussed this before, that I can have my opinion, you can have your opinion on different things, let's say trans issues or other issues, whatever. But I really always, and I'm not saying I get it right every time, but I really, really strive to never be cruel about anybody. And I think that sometimes people who are talking about transgender stuff can single out people who are high profile in that realm and be cruel and mean about them. I just don't like it. I think Dan Wootton comes across to me like kind of an asshole. I think he's over the top. He's cruel about people, and it's just not really my cup of tea. I think he's mean. So, however, so I think saying the two of them, just to briefly get into it, they were discussing a number of things, and one of them was this journalist, John, what was her name?
Ava Evans.
And the statement that was made was, who would shag her, right? And I mean, I think, I don't think that it's. I'm in two minds about this. On the one hand, I think it's a gross, crass comment to make when you're absolutely inundated with opportunities to criticize her on her opinions about a range of issues without going down that road. On the other hand, Laurence Fox has come out today, or it was I can't remember the time, and he's released a statement saying Dan Wootton has been taken off the radio or TV and has apologised. Laurence Fox is refusing to apologise, claiming that it's his freedom of speech, and that, you know, if he says that he doesn't want to shag a feminist, you know, blah, 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 he's perfectly within his rights to say so. And he's right. Like, so I kind of agree with the free speech, and he should, and I, you know, I've said on this podcast before, you shouldn't apologize because, you know, you're like absolutely entitled to have this opinion. I just think that those kind of like phrases are kind of silly and childish and play to an audience that's childish and sort of misogynistic, and you don't need to do that. It's beneath you. Like, you're smarter than that. I wouldn't shag her. Brilliant. Like, of course you're entitled to say that, but like citing your freedom of speech every time you're being crass and childish, it's for children. Like, it's silly. Just be smarter. You're of course entitled to say whatever you want. Argue your points, and I'll defend your right to argue whatever points you want. But I wouldn't shag her. It's just kind of, I don't know.
So,
Well,
so my perspective on this is, I have been obviously sort of. I never like to say I've been in the public eye, because an awful lot of people, thankfully, don't know who I am. But I've been around sort of Irish political discourse now for guts of 20 years, appearing on TV.
you've been in the public eye. Remember that time we went for a drink on Dawson Street and we were walking along together and a woman kind of hissed at you?
Yes, yeah. That does.
And I was like, what happened there? Like, what was that? It was during the referendum, and I was like, does this happen to you a lot?
It
Anyway,
it does, and in fairness, the reverse happens to me a lot. Like, I don't go
of course.
into Limerick or Dublin very often, but I normally will get somebody or two or three people coming up and saying hello and being very nice and supportive, and you get the odd hiss and the odd boo. But in my entire time of being, having strong opinions and annoying a lot of people, no doubt, I can't recall anyone ever saying who'd shag him. It's just not a thing that gets said about men. I'm not exactly an oil painting, so I don't think women sexualize men in the same way. And it did feel very like her worth as a person is tied up in her appearance, which was
he's trying to kind of row back on that a little bit in his statement that he released. Do you know what I mean? Like, he's trying to make it seem, I'll find it, keep going there and I'll find it, because I was like, that's kind of diluting it a bit. Go on.
Yeah. And in terms of the free speech thing, what I would say is that I have some relevant insight into this, because obviously I'm the editor of a media platform, and every week we get lots of submissions in. People send us in stuff asking us to publish it. And, all of those people have a right to free speech, but not all of those people get published. And the reason they don't all get published is because maybe their argument has been covered. Maybe I wrote a piece on that last week. I don't need to cover it again. Or on some occasions, maybe what you're writing is likely to get the platform into trouble, or it's likely to be deeply offensive to somebody, or it's likely to be defamatory. And I don't have a responsibility to publish what you've sent me just because you've taken the time to write it, although I really appreciate people sending me in stuff, and I hope they'll continue to do so. But not publishing somebody or saying, I don't want this argument on the platform that I edit is not an infringement of your free speech. That's slightly different from the left-wing take on things, which sort of encourages people to be denied a platform. But I don't think that this is a free speech issue for Dan Wootton. The bigger issue I have, though, with all of this, and I have a piece on Gript on this today, is sort of, so we have this cancel culture thing in society where it's sort of the new commandment now is thou shalt not offend anybody. If you say something that's offensive to particular protected groups, you should be cancelled, you should be denied a platform, and so on and so forth. And there's natural resistance to that, and there should be resistance to that. But there's an element on the populist right which sort of takes that to the next step, which sort of says, if we offend people, we are therefore being virtuous in and of itself. Like, where causing offense becomes kind of a virtue because the other side says that being offensive is bad. So therefore you should say the most shocking possible thing, get everyone mad at you on the other side, and then turn yourself into a bit of a martyr. And I think there's a little bit of that in what Laurence Fox is doing, because I have been arguing passionately with left-wingers and left-wing women in particular for most of my adult life. And, I'm no angel, but I've never had to resort to that kind of commentary. And it's not necessary, and you don't need to do it, and it makes you look bad.
Mm.
That's what I think.
He basically, I'm still trying to find what he said, but basically he was criticizing the fact that she had basically been diminishing male suicide, right? And he kind of like doesn't, thinks that makes her fair game to go for it, which it does, except, I just like, I don't know. I just
It does. It does make her
like
fair
Laurence
game to go
Fox
for.
is a smart guy, and I think that it's like, but not in this way. It's stupid to go for it this way because you've got exactly. It makes her fair game to go for. So why would you go for the most base level thing? And then in the entire argument, so now nobody's talking about the fact that people that somebody she should be on being hauled across the coals for diminishing male suicide, and now she won't be because of this.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? So go for her on the point. She's a female journalist. She's being snide about male and diminishing male suicide. Male suicide is a massive thing. It's a huge male issue. Like we talk about women's issues all the time. Male suicide is a huge issue for men. Men don't talk about, in the same way as women. They don't have the same outlets for talking as women. So for a woman to go on the radio or whatever she did and diminish male suicide like that is absolutely appalling, and she should be called out for it. And now she won't be because he's going, oh, I wouldn't like to ride her. Brilliant.
It's a bit. It's a bit. I mean? It actually relates to the conversation we had last week that got us into trouble with a section of our listeners. I mean, if you compare it to the protest at Leinster House that went a bit awry, I mean, in the aftermath of that protest, no one was talking about the concerns those people had about immigration or free speech or vaccine mandates or whatever it was they were protesting about, because their actions, or the actions, we'd be careful, the actions of a small group of them allowed everyone to talk about anything else but the issue that they wanted to talk about. It's a communications error above anything else. And I do think it's a problem. I notice this a lot because I obviously follow American politics very closely, and I notice it's a problem kind of on the right these days, where there's a tendency to kind of, the more shocking you are, the more controversy you get. The more controversy you get, the more social media followers you get. And that is pushing people to kind of pick stupid fights, not because it's for the good of the movement or it's advancing any cause, but because it's for the good of their own clout. Now, this didn't work for Laurence Fox, who's lost a major platform in GB News. But you can see his strategy of, I will not apologize, I'm going to fight, and I'm not going to be cancelled, and say what you want about me. You can see, I mean, he's getting thousands of likes for those tweets. So there's an audience for that. There are people on our side of the fence who absolutely say, fair play to you, go on, she's only a snowflake, say what you want. But I just don't think that's a good outcome for anybody. I mean, I don't particularly want to live in a society where we go around, like people in a schoolyard saying you're ugly and I wouldn't ride you. I mean,
but it is a good outcome, John. It is a good outcome, John. It's a fine outcome and it's a good outcome or whatever. If he's falling on his sword for something that people go around saying, what did he get fired for? What he said X, Y, Z. Oh, I kind of agree with that. For this, it's a nonsense reason. You're committing Harry and yourself for no good reason. Stupid. I wouldn't shag her. You're better than that. I just think it's silly, and I don't think it's something. I think, if I go into my boss at work next week and say you're fat and ugly, and I get fired, it's not really the same. It doesn't have the same kind of, dignity as me getting fired because I'm like, well, all of the workers want, to be paid overtime, and he fires me. You know what I mean? It's just stupid. And there's so much low-hanging fruit in terms of, your freedom of speech and things these days that you are and aren't allowed to say. So that's the whole, raison d'etre of Gript. Do you know what I mean? That there are things that journalists won't write about, things that people won't say, things that you can't say, and things that you get cancelled for. This is what he wants to get cancelled for. I wouldn't shag her. Stupid.
Well, somebody else who got cancelled this week was a nameless gymnastics coach. Did you see that?
Oh. Mm-hmm.
15 million views for an extraordinary act of what basically the entire media seemed to agree was racism. Now Gary and Michael covered this on their excellent podcast. If you don't like us, you like something a little different, there's always Gary and Michael on the Right Side podcast, which airs on all the same platforms as this one. And they talked about
They're
this a
very
little bit.
charming. Very, very charming.
They are, unfortunately. But I mean, what happened? I mean, this woman is being denounced internationally as a racist because she didn't give this girl a medal, and no one seems to be willing to consider the possibility that it was just an oversight.
Well, comes down for me to a kind of a principle of the way you see the world. So when I saw that video right at the beginning, I said, there must be something more to this. There must be, do you know what I mean? Like there must be a mistake or something. And it's like, you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of like I've spoken about this on the podcast before. Like I'm a 40-year-old woman, grew up in Ireland or whatever. Like I don't feel ever, like I'm not saying that misogyny doesn't exist. Everything exists. You know what I mean? But like I don't feel like I was put upon or that the world treated me that differently from my brother. Like, do you know what I mean? I don't, and if I walk down the street and, you know, I'm trying to like pull into a parking space and somebody pulls into the parking space ahead of me, I don't think he's doing that because I'm a woman. You know what I mean? Like if that's all the way I see the world, well then of course misogyny exists everywhere. If someone's rude to me in a shop, it's because I'm a woman. It's because I'm a woman. I just don't see it like that. I think there are rude people. Misogyny exists. I'm sure I've been treated badly by men. And you know, it is what it is. I've also been treated badly by women. I don't go around with this kind of expectation that the world is out to get me because of my gender, and I'm happier for it. And I think that there's a kind of a mob mentality at the moment of like everything, without any due diligence on the facts, without any efforts to, you know, find out what the background is, or just without giving, you know, like people just don't get the benefit of the doubt. 5 minutes to ascertain whether or not there might be more to this. Everyone jumps on it. Everyone virtue signals. You retweet the video. You show, you know what I mean? And like, obviously I'm not Black. I didn't grow up in Ireland or whatever. So it's not my story, but I still think that like ruining or attempting to ruin someone's life or outing somebody as being a racist in such a way is really dangerous without any like investigation or consideration of what the background to that story might be. You know what I mean? Like logically, is it possible that a gymnastics instructor or whatever the woman is went along a line of people and just decided to show her racism in front of an arena of people by not giving the Black person a medal? Like, or is there something else at play here? But no, nobody thinks that. Everyone's too busy, as you say, it's just said, looking for their online clout, looking for their weekly injection of virtue, of their virtue signaling on their platforms to show how I have to post this video to show how unracist I am. It's all nonsense. And by the way, over the years, I know two people that I can think of that are middle-aged Dublin Irish women, or more than middle-aged now, who are actually racist, right? And they're always the first to share on their Instagrams. Black Lives Matter. Myself and Keith laugh about it all the time. Like this one person in particular that we know, and I'm like, she's the most racist person I know. And she's but blacking out her Instagram, da 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 da. You know what I mean? Like I just unfollowed her at one point because I couldn't be dealing with it. But like this. Virtue, showing things on the internet show you're not a racist is a nonsense. You're just not.
Exactly.
Or you are. But yeah, it's a mob mentality, John. And actually, funnily enough, I watched a really good movie, if anyone has an hour and a half, or not a really good movie, but just a kind of a fun movie last night on Netflix. I think it's called Accused, and it's about a guy in London. There's like a bombing in London, and he is sitting at home on the one evening, the evening of the bombings, and someone who went to school with, there's a photo of the bomber on CCTV footage, and someone basically that he went to school with says, this looks a lot like whatever his name is. And then it just goes viral, and he's like kind of outed as being the bomber. And it's all about like, he's in the house on his own and these like vigilantes showing up. It's good. Like it's kind of hide behind the couch a bit, whatever. But it has an interesting point, which is that like, you know, like outing people for things that they may or may not have done is reckless in the extreme. Say nothing for the fact that even if they are guilty, like the legal structures are in place to pursue things. But like just posting up a video of some poor woman giving, medals, which may or may not be, you may be getting it wrong, is reckless. Like just and it's all for your own personal clout. Come on.
Should be said that for once, this was not an Irish-generated outrage. The guy who posted the video, I think, lives in the Middle East, and that's how it became such an international sort of story. That this was, terrible racism that had taken place in Ireland, and Ireland is a really racist country, and it kind of went internationally viral. And then it was, of course, our own lads got it, and they were at pains to say, "Oh no, this is absolutely disgraceful, but it doesn't reflect Ireland." And none of them thought to say, "Hang on a moment. This is nonsense," because you can't say that. And once you're being accused internationally, your instinct as an Irish progressive is to say, "Oh well, we're obviously improving, and there's still some dark." Yeah, exactly. I mean, for me, when I looked at it, I mean, first of all, take all the noise and nonsense out of it. It was whoever the coach was, whoever this woman was, she did make a horrendous mistake, and I understand absolutely why that little girl, whatever color, creed, or race she was, would feel horrendously slighted. And we don't know, for example, I mean, you should always consider the possibility that maybe she has in the past been the victim of racialized bullying or something like that. So maybe this is a trauma that sits deep within her, and it could have felt awful. And it's right that Gymnastics Ireland should be apologizing, and it's right that the woman who made the mistake, and I for the record, I think it was probably a genuine mistake. It's right that she should feel bad about it, because it's an awful thing to happen to that young girl. But this is life. We live in a world where, I mean, kids feel awful all the time. I played Gaelic football when I was a kid, and I stopped at around the age of 14 because I wasn't really any good. And when you're not really any good, you don't get picked for the team. You spend your whole time on the bench. You feel a little bit worthless, and there's no fun in it. And to some extent, therefore, I sympathize with those who kind of, want to make sports more about participation and less about excellence.
Fully. I mean, I have a 7-year-old. He's 7 next week, and he's obsessed with soccer, and plays for a team in Malahide and blah 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 blah. And this year they kind of streamed them, so it was just fun. And then from September they put them into different teams. Now, the gas thing about him is that he was kind of like, we used to kind of laugh. He'd be kind of standing on the pitch looking up at the sky and having it thinking about it, and then maybe he'd run at the ball, but he'd be a bit scared of it and whatever. And then he's just one of these kids who, over the summer, he did the FAI summer camp for football for 2 weeks. We went to Greece. One of the guys that we know in Greece actually plays for a Greek team. He was messing with it, and he suddenly got really good over the summer, right? So the team that he's been put in, he's suddenly the best on it, if you know what I mean. But the anxiety I used to get about him being aware that he wasn't good, or that he wouldn't be picked for the right team with his friend, and it's awful. It's so awful for kids. So I absolutely sympathize that they made a huge mistake and that they shouldn't have done that. But that doesn't mean,
no,
you know what I mean? It doesn't follow automatically that it's about. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
about. One of the things that strikes me now is that in the legal system, there is still the presumption of innocence. So for most cases, if you're accused of something and you're brought before court, there is still, in theory, the presumption that you're innocent unless you are proven guilty. But that doesn't apply in the culture. In the culture, there is now the presumption of guilt that, for example, if you are, we see this all the time. We saw it in the aftermath of Ashling Murphy, where there was kind of a mass presumption of the guilt of Irish men, that that Irish men have a systemic problem with women. And of course you get the hashtag not all men. And of course we're not talking about everybody, but you sound like you're talking about everybody. There's a presumption of guilt. There's also a presumption of guilt in this case, that that this woman is a racist until she proves that she's not. And of course you can't. How can you prove that you're not a racist? Because as you just said, some people who are very racist will be the people you would never think are, and somebody who's not at all. I mean, I had somebody say to me this week about somebody who I know very well, who doesn't know the person at all, said, "Oh, that fella is a racist," and the person who said this is a good person, in most respects. But I was really offended at them for making that assumption about somebody who they didn't know, had never spoken to, and is the least racist person that I know. And I can't and won't use names here, but it does happen that there's this presumption that if you say something, or if you make any kind of mistake, that you must be a very bad person, and it's up to you to prove that you're not. I think that's really toxic in our culture. It's really toxic, and it happens across a whole range of areas. I mean, George Hook, for example, was denounced as a misogynist for making one comment that, I think, in fairness to George, having spoken to him, he understands he phrased it badly, but he was denounced by lots of people who'd worked with him and everything as a misogynist from on high, that he actively hated women and blamed women for being raped and all of this stuff. And he was never given a chance to defend himself or explain himself. He wasn't even allowed back on air to explain himself. At least in the case of Laurence Fox that we were talking about a few minutes ago, he's made very clear he's not apologizing. He's got the opportunity now to air his views. Fair enough. But, George was never even given that opportunity. And I don't want to speak about him specifically. He's just a recent example in Irish culture of the kind of thing I'm talking about, where there's the automatic assumption of the worst of people. And that's what's happened here. And I think it's something that's really toxic in our society, because it has everybody watching themselves to an extreme degree. Do you remember Panty Bliss? And by the way, I'll talk about Panty Bliss in a moment. Do you remember Panty Bliss gave this speech in the Abbey Theatre during the marriage equality referendum, saying, "I check myself, because I'm a gay person walking around Dublin. I go to, when I'm at a bus stop, I check myself. When I'm in public, I check myself to make sure I'm not being too gay," or whatever the case may be. And it was thunderously applauded, because, in fairness to Panty, it was a really good speech, and it was I
very
think that's
empathy inducing. Would that be right?
Yeah, but we've moved away from that, to the extent that, I mean, on the subject of Panty, this week, Panty announced to the public that I, as in yours truly, as in your host of this podcast, should be shunned and should not be decent people everywhere, hairdressers, publicans, people who own shops, I should be shunned from polite society and basically driven out of anywhere I go into, because apparently the protest on Kildare Street that I condemned was my fault. And that's an example. I mean, I once again, I have to prove, apparently, that I'm not a Nazi, and she, whatever Panty identifies as these days, doesn't have to prove that I am. That's the kind of cultural environment that we live in, and that's what this woman was a victim of as well. She is a racist until she somehow proves that she's not. I think that's toxic and disgusting, frankly, because I think it's fairly obvious to anyone with a brain, as you said, that if she was a racist, most racists aren't dumb enough to do openly racist things in front of huge crowds of people who aren't racist, which is what is alleged to have happened here. So it's just all very depressing. And very unfortunate. And once again, I think, based on all the coverage of it I saw, we had the entire Irish media running with this narrative, and we had a huge swathe of the public. I don't know whether it's a majority, minority, but I think it's probably a majority of those viewing who just said, "What's this about?" I mean, clearly there's a different explanation here. Why is no one being open to it? But it doesn't matter, because once you're in that media bubble, you just run with the condemnation. And, it's the, what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the Carlow school case all over again. Do you remember when the teachers were all misogynists until it suddenly turned out that they weren't? And they were basically commenting on schoolgirls' bottoms until it turned out they hadn't. And no one ever apologized for that. And no one will ever apologize for calling this woman a racist.
But I also love the way there are people, and I'm here for it. I love the spirit of it. Who continue to comment underneath the tweets of some journalists saying, when are you going to apologize? And they won't let it go. They won't let it go. And I love it. Like, I just love it. But like, just the dedication that they have to that cause. I'm if you're listening and you're doing that, I admire you. Brilliant.
Well, on that, I spoke. I think I was the only. I mean, and there aren't many things in that I'd say absolutely proud of, but I am proud that week I was the only journalist in sort of the national media, if you can call Gript the national media. I think you can, who was skeptical of the story publicly and who spoke to the teachers in the school. And I can tell you the teachers in the school had the most horrendous time because, first of all, there are only a small number of male teachers in that school. Secondly, there's only 2 male PE teachers in that school. Everyone in that community was whispering about who it was that was looking up the young ones. The teachers concerned are married with young kids. It was horrendous for them. And nobody thought about this at all. It was just, oh yeah, these men are toxic misogynists. They're eyeing up your daughters. Be very careful about it. I mean, it was what those people went through in that week was utterly horrendous, and no one has ever had the grace to apologize. I think actually no, not. I think Jill Kirby is the one national journalist. She's a business columnist for I think the Times, who has had the grace to say sorry about that. The rest of them, and that includes some very senior household name journalists, have never so much as acknowledged that they got that one wrong.
And politicians as well. Don't forget the politicians.
Adon O'Riordan, I remember specifically. I mean, I'm going to call him out on it. I mean, holier than the holiest of the holiest, the Archbishop of Clontarf himself, who never had the good grace to say, I got that one wrong. And never will have the good grace to say he got that one wrong. That's just who he is. But the case of the racist gymnast coach is very much in that sphere. And if she happens to listen to this podcast, I presume she's not, but if she ever happens to speak, you have our sympathies, because I think you made a very bad mistake, but there's absolutely no evidence for the condemnation that's being thrown at you. Anyway, speaking of politicians, new opinion poll out this morning.
Yes.
What did you make of it?
Sinn Féin up again. I think Mary Lou kind of did a bit of a press tour the last week or two, so she's back following an illness. So I think that's probably helping them. But I think these polls are interesting in that they're not interesting, if you know what I mean. Like there's two points here, 2 points there, or whatever, but nothing ever really changes. There's a kind of a consistency to them now that should have been a worry to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael about 2 years ago, but they don't seem to be perturbed by it at all. So we can only assume that they're not reading them, or I don't know. But yeah.
So I want to highlight some stuff in the poll that I think isn't getting enough attention. So obviously the poll at the overall figures, Sinn Féin are on 34%, but right. I'm intrigued by the figures amongst 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds. So I mean the figures are basically identical for both age groups. There's like a 1% difference, but basically amongst that age group, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are on 12% for Fianna Fáil in the 18 to 24-year-olds, 9 in the 25 to 34-year-olds, 11 for Fine Gael and 15, respectively, in those two age groups. Sinn Féin on 44 and 43. And independents and others, actually, on 24% amongst the youngest voters and 26% amongst the 25 to 34-year-olds. Amongst people under 34, either Sinn Féin or independents are piling up almost 70% of the vote between them in this poll. So like that's a huge chunk of the young vote. I mean, everyone will talk about Sinn Féin getting 44%, right? That's a big share. But independents and others, the people who aren't voting for any of them amongst the youngest voters, they're at over a quarter of the vote, which just tells me, I mean, Irish politicians, aside from Sinn Féin, are not talking or have zero relevance almost to the youngest voters in the country. It's an extraordinary indictment, I think, of the political system. I mean, as you get older, obviously Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael support grows. But I put that to you, Sarah, as somebody called you last week, a scion of a Fianna Fáil dynasty. That that is a dynastic vote. That is people who have always voted Fianna Fáil and really don't actually know that you're not allowed to vote for Fianna Fáil. Sorry, that you're allowed not to vote for Fianna Fáil. Do you know those people? They're out there, and they're for Fine Gael as well. People who actually. I remember when I ran for election in 2011. I remember distinctly meeting one voter who I think was really under the impression that they actually weren't allowed. They actually were allowed to not vote for. I think it was Fine Gael. Like those two parties' decline is really stark when you look at the younger voters. And we're not talking here kids, we're talking people 34 years of age and younger. So
yeah, I mean, I think like politics has changed in Ireland, in the world, and people but young people have always, we spoke about this before about people going to the Wolf Towns and Sinn Féin, and Micheál's comments about young people, and was it as he said they were brought into a cult or something? The cult of, what was the quote again? Mm-hmm. So I think I think that there's a number of things. I think young people who aren't brought up in a family that is particularly political go through phases of kind of thinking about different things and supporting different political parties and then they change, or maybe they don't, or whatever. That's all fine. But I think that also what you're seeing there is that there is a generation of people who aren't having their needs met by the current government, whether it be housing, whether it be something else, and are gravitating towards somebody who seems to be speaking their language. And it's interesting that that such a large percentage, like 70% of young people, are going towards Sinn Féin or independence, when nobody is trying to court and seduce, for want of a better word, that vote group more than Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and they're getting nothing for it. Meanwhile, alienating their core vote slowly but surely over the last few years. I always said that the direction that Fianna Fáil was taking was kind of practically ringing up Una Mullally and asking Una who she wanted Fianna Fáil to be, and that's a vote that's never going to vote for you. Long term, that's not they're not going to vote for you. And so trying to court that vote all the time is it hiding to nothing, and it is. And Fianna Fáil, polls could be up, down, and up to and down to, or whatever, but Fianna Fáil has been stagnating for a long time. And that's not just because of young people, but young people, if people it's also to do with the timing. People can be Sinn Féin and I'm young and I want this and I want that and whatever for a while, but you're talking about people now who are reaching into an age where they may have voted for 4 general elections and never voted for you. Do you know what I mean? That becomes a pattern that's hard to break. If you sat down at your first general election and said, oh my God, Fianna Fáil ruined the country and Fianna Fáil did this and I'm never voting for them, and now you voted in multiple elections since, I'm not going to do the maths off the top of my head because I can't remember what years the election was, but you get my point. You develop a pattern where the idea that and what you see is that there was that exact thing happened to Sinn Féin voters. That's why there's people over a certain age who are way less likely to vote for Sinn Féin, because they couldn't imagine voting for Sinn Féin, because they have years of saying, well, I'll never ever ever. I mean, I've been canvassing since I'm literally 4 years of age, and I can remember for years knocking on doors and people saying, well, whatever happens, not Sinn Féin, and they were always of a certain age. They'll spend their life actively voting for anyone but Sinn Féin. But what Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have done, are starting to do now, I think, and the concern is that they're creating a generation of people who'll do the same about them. And that's a big problem, because ultimately it's all very well to be really popular, moderately popular in the 65 and 75 and 85-year-olds. But, not to be too morbid, but they're dying. There's a 85-year-olds, statistically speaking, will see one more general election. Some will see more, but most of them won't. And so you're losing your vote share all the time trying to, something has to give here for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Trying to be cool all the time has done you no favours. You've tried it for years. It's not working. So go back to to basics here. And like, I mean, I don't have the answer. I don't know like what there is to do there, but I know one thing. Whatever is being done right now ain't working.
Well, the other thing is I look into the future when I see these numbers and I see like forget the Sinn Féin figure, because the Sinn Féin figure is simply Sinn Féin are the most radical option that's available right now. That's what they are. They are the most. I mean, the most radical. I'll tweak that slightly. The most radical option that's a viable party of government that's available right now. I mean, obviously there'll be some people who want more radical, so they'll vote for People Before Profit and Paul Murphy, and so be it. There'll be 2 or 3% of the electorate who vote that way, like there always are. But if you're a young person and you're looking to radically give the system a boot, Sinn Féin are where you go. But then on the other side, the massive vote for independence suggests to me that there are also people who want to give the system a boot, who don't want to vote for Sinn Féin, but they want to give the system a boot. If I was somebody in one of the 2 bigger parties, or indeed the Labour Party, which doesn't feature at all, by the way, amongst younger voters, I would be very concerned. Despite all the efforts. I mean, it disappears entirely amongst 18 to 24s, literally 0% for the Labour Party amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. I would say this is evidence of an emerging radicalism in the electorate. And it's not just on the left. 44% of them, are going to Sinn Féin. But I think there's a big chunk hiding. I mean, if you look at France, for example, and Italy, and where Meloni did really well, Le Pen does extraordinarily well in France amongst the youngest voters. Meloni, I think, won almost a majority of the youngest voters in Italy. Trump is actually making inroads amongst young voters in the US. Like there's an emerging young generation that's moving radically in another direction as well. And I think when and it's not if at this stage, when Sinn Féin take power, be that in 2025, and if not 2025, I would imagine certainly 2029, we're going to see that radicalism express itself in a different oppositional way. There's a huge shift and a hunger to tear down what you might call the established liberal order in Ireland. And I don't mean liberal in the sort of social sense either. I mean economics. I mean the whole model that we've had basically since the fall of the Berlin Wall. There's a huge antipathy to it amongst younger voters. And I think that is both exciting, but also potentially very, very dangerous. And the political establishment, as far as I can see, has no response to it. They have no ideas. They have no conception of why it's happening. There is just this sense that this will pass. This tide will go out. We'll just keep our heads down. Business as usual will come back if we just keep muddling on as we always have. I think it's going to get more radical over the next 15, 20 years. That's what I think.
Do you think it's better for Ireland, just for politics, or for, let's take away the potential, policy, the introduction of policy. Do you think it's better for politics in Ireland if Sinn Féin get in this election or not? Next election or not?
I think it's better for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael if they do. Yeah, I mean, it's their one chance really to rebuild an opposition, I think, because if it goes on, those parties could be destroyed. I don't see. I mean, I have the greatest respect for any young person who's involved in politics, and obviously I see Ógra Fianna Fáil and Ógra Fine Gael plugging away. But when I was young and involved in youth politics, we were all oddballs then, and you're all kind of oddballs now too. And I don't say that it's okay to be an oddball, but you don't think you're involved in youth politics for one of those 2 parties and think you're representative of your generation, because you're not. That's just the bottom line. And I think their only real chance to get that generation back is to formulate an alternative policy arrangement to Sinn Féin once Sinn Féin are in power. And become the voice of that youth radicalism in a way that they can't be at the moment. I think it goes on another election after this one, and they muddle on and they put a government back together. I think they're in genuine risk of, if not extinction, then going the way of the Labour Party and becoming a minor factor. And Fine Gael people don't seem to think that's possible. You talk to them, they don't think it's like, oh, we have the organisation, we have. You look around the country, your organisation is ancient. Your common meetings are you try to find dark hair in a common meeting or a branch meeting. It's not there. You're. I remember in 2002 election, I remember canvassing in Cavan Monaghan for Rory O'Hanlon, who was a very senior politician at that stage. He became Count Corla, I think, after that election. And like there were armadas of people out campaigning for, and they it wasn't for him. It was the Fianna Fáil machine.
Yeah.
The Fianna Fáil machine doesn't exist anymore anywhere. I mean, maybe there are individual politicians within Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael who have their own political machine, maybe. But the
volume
institution
of numbers has dropped off. Yeah.
The institution. I mean, you know this. Your father was elected for years in what is now Dublin Bay South, and has gone through many. He had a big organisation. There was a huge, big institutional Fianna Fáil movement in that constituency. Like, I don't mean to offend your honour as a Fianna Fáiler, but it's not there anymore.
No, but I don't think that's a Fianna Fáil. I don't think that's a Fianna Fáil phenomenon. I think that's a Fine Gael one as well. I think there's loads of problems there. I think you're right in the sense that, like, when I think about, like young people who are involved in politics, it's lovely. Like, it's wonderful. It's great crack. You meet friends for life. Anyone I know who's joining or starting college, I always encourage them to do it. Some do, some don't, whatever. You're right that it's not representative, whatever, but it's fun, and it's, there's a bit of crack, and people buy you drinks, and, there's kind of whatever, and you go out canvassing and you have a bit of crack. But like, when I think about those young people, like if Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael formulate another government with the Greens or whatever after the next general election, I feel exhausted for them at the idea of going out once again and trying to kind of, be upbeat and positive about Sinn Féin getting more TDs, but not being, you know what I mean? It's just, there's a kind of a, like there's a kind of a, just, it's exhaustion, I'd say. They'll be tired. It won't be fun. You're not going to, like, when I was in college and you go out in camps, yeah, of course there'd be people. Of course there was always people who were like, you're, Fianna Fáil or whatever. But there was some people who loved you, and, there was people who you had the crack with them, and, whatever. There was a buzz. I don't see how there's any buzz after another general election, going out and saying, and it's something about it. I'm not a Sinn Féin voter, that's well established, but there's a part of me that just thinks, maybe it's best to just get on with this. And, if Sinn Féin are going to be in government this election or the next election, maybe it's time to just, let that happen and let the parties recover, and let the parties, start to kind of reconfigure and think about what they stand for, or who they want to be, or what kind of Ireland they want to represent.
You probably have more faith in that happening than I do, though, because I look at Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and I don't see any. I really don't see where any kind of intellectual spark is going to come from. I don't. I mean, you look at Fine Gael this week. Charlie Flanagan is retired. I think he's somebody said during the week that if you go across the southern half of the country, sort of Kilkenny, Carlow, Wexford, lots of Cork, Tipperary, like there's only one Fine Gael TD that's actually standing for re-election. All the rest of them are standing down. I don't think that's a coincidence. It's not that they're all old. I mean, John Paul Phelan, who we both know and respect, I think, is a very young man who is just packing it in because he's sick of it. Yeah. And I want to emphasize there, I'm not putting words into John Paul's mouth. I'm not saying he's sick of Fine Gael, but I think he's had enough of the political grind, put it that way. Like the energy.
And I think when you're in politics, and certainly, like, I noticed this, and I've spoken to people who were former Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil TDs. Now, when you're in it, you think it's the whole world. You think it's like this, like nothing that happens that's important doesn't happen, in politics, because it's the center of the universe. And the reality of it is that for a lot of people who live in Ireland, it isn't. And I know people, very, very good friends, who don't engage or think or talk about politics ever, who live their lives with a very, very cursory glance at who's in power, who'd be able to name the Taoiseach, but probably wouldn't be able to name any other minister, or, most of the time don't know what's going on and don't care. And they're happy out. And I think that, if you've been in politics like Sean Paul or John Paul and other people that I know who've left politics, like, they realize that, there's other things in life. Like, politics is great, but, your family is more important. Your happiness, your health, these things are way more important. And, you can be in politics for a while, you can serve, you can do the work you want to do, and you can move on to something else. And you don't have to, stick with it forever. And I think that there's people who are brave who say, yeah, I've done this, but I've had enough. And they're right to do that. I don't agree that there's not. I would say that in Fianna Fáil, there's, and I'm not going to start naming names because I don't want to put words into people's mouths or act like they've spoken to me about it, which they haven't. But I think that there are people in Fianna Fáil who are very bright and do have, like, huge capacity to come up with, policies and ideas that are not getting any airtime at the moment. And I think that that's a leadership issue in Fianna Fáil. I think that it's difficult for some people to, get a name for themselves because they don't have the necessary relationship with leadership of the party.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, speaking of the leadership,
that would be different.
Speaking of the leadership of the party, though, I mean, you're talking about intellectual spark. I mean, the man basically came out as far right activist this week. I
always knew he had it in him, John.
Yeah, he now says it's going to be a very, very difficult budget because of all the extra people in the country, which is extraordinary. Because if you or me went on RTE primetime and said that, you'd have people screaming that RTE shouldn't have platformed such hateful far right rhetoric, and yet there is the Taoiseach of the country saying it. The CSO figures came out this week, by the way. The population has increased by about 97,000 since this time last year. Of that, 70,000 of the increase, the CSO says, is a result of immigration, and 20% is 20,000 is 20,000, about 20% as well, is the result of natural growth, i.e., more births than deaths amongst Irish people. So, I mean, I don't know what he was thinking in saying that, even from a purely political standpoint. He's basically saying, immigration, which we say is great and necessary, is costing everyone money, and it's going to be a difficult budget as a result of it. But I also thought it was fascinating to hear him talking like that, and it was also very ironic because we've had so much, say that 6 months ago, and you'd be called basically a far right activist for saying it.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when I was old enough to remember when something had to have been at least 5 years old before you were able to say you're old enough to remember. But now it's 6 months. You know what I mean? Like 6 months ago, if someone had gone on TV and said, there's too many people, this is going to have an impact on resources, that we're racist. He's right in what he's saying. That's fine. But it's just, it's I don't know, rules for thee and not for me. Why is that okay to say now when it wasn't 6 months ago?
Well, I think actually this is a bigger issue for Fine Gael than Fianna Fáil, because Fine Gael have been in government since 2011. And in fairness to Micheál Martin, I think if he was pushed on this, now no one asked him about it because I think there was a sense in the media, we don't want to amplify these comments, so he wasn't asked about it. But I think if he was asked about it, he would say that he was talking about the last decade more than just the last year, because the population has increased. But I mean, first of all, you're bringing more people in when you've already got an infrastructure problem. And secondly, we have an infrastructure problem because the party that has been in government since 2011, that election, has basically underinvested in schools, hospitals, roads, you name it, to the extent that we can't cope with the number of people we already have. So it's either these problems are a result of immigration, which is bad for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, or it's because these problems are a result of sustained underinvestment in the sort of, I'm not talking about public services, but I'm talking about the infrastructure you need in the country to cope with the number of people you have, which is a Fine Gael problem, and partially a Fianna Fáil problem because they caused the mess that caused austerity in the public's eyes. I know you might dispute that, but so I think it's a really toxic issue for them. That's one of the reasons why immigration is a really toxic issue, because if you start talking about the number of people in the country being too great, it's either immigration or it's that you messed up by not building enough houses.
What I also think is going to be a problem for both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in this budget is that there was, and we discussed this before, and I think that like last year there was a huge. I think budgets are kind of they have multiple functions. Obviously, there's the financial function of a budget at base level, but there's also kind of a psychological function. Like last year, that I think that the budget wasn't bad and providing some reassurance for a lot of people who were really terrified about the cost of energy bills and stuff coming up in the budget. And there was some, things done in that regard, and it helped somewhat. But I think that there was too much. I think that they're going to, because they've created a rod for their own back in the sense that there's a huge amount of self-congratulation about surpluses and how much money we have. And then to come out and start saying, oh, it's going to be hard because there's more people.
Mm-hmm.
But last year you were all patting yourselves on the back saying how great it was that you had a rainy day fund and so much extra money, and the tax take was, what was the figures again? Remember, it was like double, triple what was forecast, and everything is wonderful and everything is going so well. You can't do that and then come back and say, oh well, guys, brace yourselves because there's more people now and this budget is going to be tougher. Those two things can't exist at the same time.
At the same time as people are, forget immigration, but people are paying €2 at the pump for a litre of petrol. They are in significant difficulty because they've ramped up expectations of how much money there is, and at the same time, lots of people are struggling, and there isn't enough money to even touch on alleviating people's struggles. Anyway, I think we'll leave it there. Just some housekeeping for people who, if you've made it this far, and many of you do, as I know. Next week we will be joined by Senator Ronan Mullen for a chat. He had hoped to join us over the summer, but he, just various things came up and wasn't able to be here, but we're looking forward very much to that. And we'll have other guests in the weeks to come because we've been a bit low on guests recently. So we'll fix that. But I think for now, until then, from Sarah and from me, thank you very much. Goodbye. And that, as ever, was the week that really was.